This is an extract from a keynote which was for an Australia-wide maths conference for primary school teachers and high school teachers. So for that purpose, I picked an example that sits at the interface between primary school and high school, which, you know, I'm aware we've got a lot of early years educators in the room, but what I wanted to say to you was, when I look at your high yield practices, the early years outline produced by the numeracy literacy team, I see parallels between what I'm going to speak about and those practices that you've been talking about. So if you're familiar with those practices, you'll be able to make those connections as we go through this today. And if those practices are new to you, if you're looking at that and wondering what that is, I'd highly recommend a session that Rob and Cara is going to run, one of the breakout sessions tomorrow afternoon for early years educators that looks specifically at those high yield practices. So I just want to anchor the thinking as we go into this session. I don't want it to be seen as something new and another story. I just want to give you some mental hooks to anchor your thinking. First of all, back to this morning. So the key messages that came out of this morning is that the way that we get students thinking about content makes a difference. We are still absolutely focused on our students developing strong content understanding, but the way that we do that matters. And that other strong message that came out, that if your partnership is focusing on embedding, teaching for effective learning, or executive functions, or you're focusing on growth mindset, it's about picking a starting point that matters. And these things, it's a kind of, I don't even like the sentence, but it's a kind of all roads lead to Rome. You can take a starting point and you will get there, and I think you'll see those connections being made as we go through this example. I want to go back just a little bit further in your thinking as well to create another one of those mental hooks for you to hang on to as we look at this specific example. And this is to just a couple of minutes of words from Professor Guy Claxton. I'm sure you're familiar with this, but I've listened to it frequently actually, because I think in these 2 minutes he really captures the role that we as a community leading change in numeracy and literacy really need to hang on to these words of wisdom, I think, from Guy Claxton.
I think this is the right way of thinking about the choice that all of us as school leaders, people who care about doing the best for young people, this is the right way of thinking about what that choice is. It's 2 ways of getting good results, but one of them prepares young people powerfully to be able to cope well with novelty and uncertainty, and the other doesn't. So the choice is this: we can get good results in a way that produces young people who are passive, dependent, and anxious about failure, or, and this is obviously over-polarized, or we can get good results and produce young people who are inquisitive, imaginative, and independent in their approach to learning. And that's the choice we're faced with. We don't have to look at the choice as either it's grades and standards and driving up performance and increasing the results on NAPLAN and those kinds of indicators, or we're going to do some fluffy, nebulous, ill-conceived, newfangled stuff about preparing young people for an uncertain world. No, that's not the choice we have to make. The choice is, how do we do both? And can we do both?
So hanging on to those messages from this morning, you can see the similarities between those core messages that came out of Martin's presentation this morning, the core message that was coming out of what Guy has said to us on numerous occasions. So, and of course our position is yes, of course we can do both. And so what we're going to look at now is, what is our current dominant pedagogy, and really what does that look like? What does it look like in a maths example? What does it look like in a maths classroom? And then what will it look like when we've moved to a new pedagogy? So our collective challenge really is moving from this current dominant pedagogy. We know this is our dominant pedagogy from the TfEL research, but then we've just heard it from those groups. When I went round with the microphone again, we heard again that a year and a half, 2 years after we completed the TfEL research, that the dominant pedagogy is still focused on content delivery, and it's still transmission and instruction delivered. And people are doing that with good intention, in part because they're feeling the pressure of time. So it's not that people aren't thinking about wanting to work differently, but they're feeling some pressures that stop them from working differently. And we're going to look then to so our collective challenge of our aspired to dominant pedagogy, which is a responsive, intentional, design-oriented pedagogy, where yes, content is still absolutely focused on, but we are also being intentional about developing a whole other broader range of skills and dispositions in our students. So we're going to think about this through the question that most teachers face at the beginning of planning a unit of work. If you're using learning design, box 1 of learning design says, what's the intended learning and why is that important? So most models of learning design that teachers will be using to plan their unit of work start at least with that first part of the question, what's the intended learning? So if we're lucky, people are asking, and why is that important? So we're going to look at that question now through our current dominant pedagogy, that transmission, content-driven pedagogy, and look at what that would look like in the classroom if that's the view that our teachers are bringing to the beginning of their planning of their unit of work. And then we'll look at exactly the same piece of content, but through the eyes of a teacher who's brought a more design-oriented, responsive pedagogy and trying to develop a broader range of skills. So, if we're looking through this pedagogy, our current dominant pedagogy, that transmission pedagogy, a response to that question might be something like this. What's the intended learning? Students learn to calculate the area of a parallelogram. Why is it important? It's in the curriculum, or it's in the test. So if that's your position, if that's your thinking, then this is a reasonable response to the learning design that you're planning, to the beginning of that unit of work. And I know that you can't see all of the writing on there, but it really won't matter. There's some bigger text that are going to come up. This is a synthesis of, we did a survey of the 2 most commonly used textbooks across South Australian classrooms in high schools. We looked at both of those textbooks, how they introduced this topic. We also looked at the kind of worksheets that teachers use online. And this is a kind of synthesis of that, so we're not singling out any particular textbook. But essentially, all of them start by saying, okay, we're doing parallelograms today, and here's a parallelogram. You don't even have to think about it. We're going to give you some information about this is the base, and this is the height of the parallelogram. And then we're going to tell you what the area of the parallelogram is. So we've been told so far. And then there's a little bit of explanation that goes on. In case you're not quite sure about why that's the area of the parallelogram, we're going to really quickly in this little paragraph say to you, and this is why. If you chop the end off your parallelogram, the triangle off the end of it, you move it to the other side, it looks like a rectangle. And the kids are told or shown that information. And then finally, the next kind of step in the information is the students are then shown how to use that formula that they were given. So there's an example modelled, and finally after that, they're asked to use that example that they've been walked through. So we've got a diet really of told, shown why, and then asked to apply or asked to use. And the problem for us as leaders of this shift is this need not look like a textbook on every child's desk. It might be computers in front of the students. And it's essentially a computerised textbook, or it's a worksheet that's behind a glass screen. But the thinking that the students are required to do is no different to if they had an old paper textbook in front of them. The next kind of level of that I think we see is there's no textbook on the desks, there's not even a computerised version of a textbook, but there's a teacher in front of an interactive whiteboard, and the teacher's manipulating a parallelogram for the kids on the interactive whiteboard. So it looks higher tech, but the thinking, the question for us as leaders is the thinking that the students are being asked to do any different to that told, shown and asked to use formula that they come across when they're working from a textbook, when they're doing the learning from a textbook? So I know that that's a maths example, but I just want to give you a minute now to say, what's the equivalent in literacy? Because that can't just be us as maths teachers. That's going on in literacy learning as well. What's the equivalent in the early years of schooling? But probably most importantly, what I want you to identify is what are the unintended consequences of our students learning in that way? So just a few quick words that you can give back to us from the group, please. Just 1 minute, what are the unintended consequences of our students learning in this way? What are the unintended consequences of our students learning in this way? Table 8, can you give us a word to summarise the unintended consequences?
Yeah, we discussed it as passive learning. It's more so generate just like a formula approach to everything, and there's no thinking outside the box.
So it's a formulaic approach, and the kids are quite passive in the story.
And they're not engaging in that. Maths is a beautiful, creative, exploratory topic. It's very much done too.
It's a dollop of maths landing on them, isn't it? Yeah. Okay. And table 14. So if you learn the formula, you'll be able to perform. It's a performance orientation, which goes back to what Martin was saying this morning about the performance orientation and the fixed mindset. So there's a fixed mindset message coming through there. So classically, what we hear, and I've asked this question to a lot of people now, is passive is probably the first thing that people say. The students are learning to be passive, or they're being passive in their learning. People often say the students are learning to be dependent on somebody else, something external for the construction of their knowledge, for the development of their knowledge. Anxious is another one that comes up. That sort of approach to learning is part of the maths anxiety story, which we know if we're going to do anything, if we're going to move anything to do with maths achievement, we've got to address that maths anxiety issue. Lower resilience with problem solving. And disconnected facts, that idea of learning maths in this kind of dollop of information that's just been dropped on you, or it feels like it for those students. So let's have a look now then at the other side of that story. So what does it look like? What does our aspired to dominant pedagogy look like? What does it look like when we see a design-oriented, responsive approach happening in teaching? So perhaps when at the beginning of planning a unit of work, a teacher who's taking this view might say, what's the intended learning? I'm going to build understandings. I'm going to get my students to establish general rules for themselves. That generalisation that Martin was talking about this morning, the teacher's intentionally saying, I'm going to get my students to do generalisation. I'm going to get them to work collaboratively. And yes, I'm still going to get them to learn to calculate the area of the parallelogram. But now that content is a vehicle for developing those other skills. And those teachers respond to us about the why. Well, why? Because the content's in the curriculum, certainly, but because the other skills are the lifelong transferable skills. So when my students are, have grown up and they're 30 years old, and the only application for working out the area of the parallelogram is doing their children's homework, they've still got something else out of this time that they spent with me while they were learning about the area of parallelogram. So how do we do that? So this is something that we've taken into the classroom, we've done with students. We've given students pairs of shapes. This is just one example, by the way, this is just our response. Pairs of shapes, either the blue pair or the green pair or the red pair. And the students have got their pairs of shapes, and we ask them this question. So for your pair of shapes that you've got, which has got the bigger area? The rectangle or the parallelogram? What do you think they say? Parallelogram. About 80% of our kids say that parallelogram in each pair is bigger than the rectangle. Now, I don't know if you can see it from the screen, but of course what we've done as educators is make the rectangle and parallelogram pair of exactly the same area. But the students don't believe that. So quite how the questioning develops in a different classroom that we take this into is different in different cases, but this is essentially, these questions I'm going to show you kind of essentially model how this questioning flows. What makes you think that? So now we've got their opinion and their reasoning about their opinion. How sure are you? So now we're holding them in a space where they're thinking again about their opinion. Now we're going to make them share their opinion with someone else, because could you convince someone who thinks differently to you? So we're still in their opinion space. Now we're asking them to start noticing similarities and differences between the rectangle that they've got and the parallelogram that they've got. So are the heights the same? Is there something the same about the lengths of these shapes? Students still, at this point, are in what might be the case. It's very open, and the entry point for this is just your opinion. And we've gone through all of those steps before we've said to them, so could you work out the area of a parallelogram? We know you can work out the area of a rectangle, or I wouldn't be teaching this to you. I shouldn't be. It doesn't matter what year group they're in. If they don't know how to work out the area of a rectangle, I shouldn't be doing this. So, could you work out the area of a parallelogram? Is there a rule that will work for all these parallelograms that we've got in the classroom? Can you tell me a rule, a bit like you've got a rule for working out the area of a rectangle? Could you lift that idea and transfer it across and work out the area of a parallelogram as well? Come up with a rule for that? And then, what names will you give to the dimensions that you're going to use in a parallelogram? That's really different to the position that we were in the textbook example, where the students were told it was called base and height, whether they were naturally going to call it length and width anyway. So what names are you going to give to the dimensions you need on your parallelogram? How are you going to communicate that information? Perhaps in diagrams, perhaps in words, perhaps in symbols. Remember, all three of those was given to the student in the textbook example. And then finally, but really importantly, let's compare that to what the rest of the world thinks. Because this is us being mathematicians in our classroom, and we've come up with a way of talking about parallelograms and a way of expressing the area. And we know it works, we're confident, but how does everybody else talk about this? And at that point, you can look at that information that was in that textbook, or was on that worksheet, or is on that website. But at that point, the students got ownership of that thinking. They know that they had the capacity, just as those mathematicians did years ago, to work out what the area of a parallelogram was going to be. So I want to compare that before and after example in 4 different ways, really quickly. So, first of all, thinking about the thinking that's demanded. My summary of the thinking that's demanded in that first task was told, shown, and asked to use. My summary of the thinking that was demanded in that second task was they were asked to compare. They started out by comparing the two shapes. The students were asked to convince each other of their opinion around the area of those shapes. So they should start there. So we've got entry point, which is compare, and that's their opinion. Really importantly, every single child, irrespective of the level of ability in that room, every child is expected to do some transfer, to engage in transfer. And Martin was speaking this morning about how important that transfer is. Every child was taking what they know about a rectangle and being challenged to change that into something else, into a parallelogram. And then finally, they were asked to generalise. They were asked to establish a rule for themselves. So the entry point is low. The exit point for that task is generating an algebraic statement. That's a high exit point. But what we see is the vast majority of students in a mixed ability class will exit the learning, will exit this lesson, having generalised. They will have engaged in transfer and generalisation. And then thinking about the mindset of those students who were engaged in that learning. Which do we think is supporting the development of a growth mindset? The one where the second one where the students are engaged in that productive struggle, where they see themselves as people who are capable creators of their own mathematics, or where they see themselves as a role of needing to be quiet and listening to this, maths genius who's positioned themselves in front of them and is giving them information. Which one helps our students to develop a faith in themselves? The role of the teacher is entirely different. This is what I've been hearing people talking about today. From those two models, the role of the teacher shifts from there's this fundamental teacher instructing, teacher as the holder of the knowledge in the first model, to a teacher seeing themselves as somebody who helps students to construct knowledge in the second model. And that's huge. That shift in the role of the teacher is the thing that we're all grappling with as leaders. But a key question I find when I'm working with people to get them, to help them to make that shift, is ask yourself this. For everything that you are going to design learning for with your students, ask yourself, do I need to tell this information, or is there a question I can ask so that my students can reason the information for themselves? My students are never going to reason that that shape is called a parallelogram. You can stare at it and you can think about it, and you're never going to go, you know what, I think that should be called a parallelogram. But if I ask them the right questions, they can tell me how to work out its area. So there's some information that I just need to tell them, because you can't reason it. And there's a whole heap of the maths curriculum that actually, if we ask the right questions, our students can reason and construct their knowledge for themselves. So when we were designing that second task, that task where the students are comparing, convincing, transferring, and establishing a rule, in our minds as designers, the shift that we were looking for was one from telling to asking. That was what we held in our mind when we were designing that learning experience, from tell to ask. And there was a second really important shift that we were holding in our minds. And that was from our students having a piece of information, leaving the lesson with a piece of information, the formula for the area of a parallelogram, and our students leaving that lesson with some understanding, some fundamental understanding about conservation of area, about the nature of the way that an area of a shape can be calculated. So in transforming tasks that Martin showed you a screenshot of this morning, I know that some of you have started work on this already. They are two of the four key ways that we have articulated the shift, so that when we're designing learning, we can hold that really simple language in mind. Of course, the other two, that's not the whole story, and the other two that we've kind of completed that with is you could think about moving from closed questions to open questions, or from procedural type questions to problem-based or problem-solving type questions. And all of these key strategies, if you hold them in mind, will get you to the same place. Much like Martin was talking about, starting with executive functions, starting with TfEL, it will get you to the same place. We feel the same way about these key ideas, these key strategies in transforming tasks. And so for each of those strategies, we developed just 4 techniques. Not because they're the only 4 techniques that can be used to get the shift from tell to ask, but because they're 4 techniques that we feel are really achievable for teachers. They're 4 techniques that they could add to their toolkit, if you like, to start them off with making these bigger strategic shifts in their learning design. And you can see in the example that I've just been through with you, the parallelograms example, we started with this one, compare and contrast. We got the students to explore before we explained anything. And finally, we got them to generalise. So actually, in designing that entire learning experience for students, we combined 3 different strategies from transforming tasks. But we know that if we just ask teachers to transform the task, that becomes a really big step in the learning design. And so the idea behind the resources that sit in the tool Transforming Tasks is that we focus in on just one of those things. So we focus in on just how do you use the idea of compare and contrast to drive this difference between students having information and students gaining understanding. So we're trying to support teachers to learn their way into just that one piece, and then separately learn your way into how to use explore before explain. What else do you need to be doing as the educator to make this work? And of course the intention is that in just the same way as in that example I shared with you, we combined those different techniques. The intention is that ultimately teachers will combine those different techniques to produce much more complex, design-oriented learning experiences for our students.